Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I can certainly hear my voice in the room finally. So welcome, everybody. And I hope we have our third panelist online as well. So hopefully she will come to your screens very soon.
You see me?
Where is she? They're going to project her when it's.
Oh, there she is. There we go. There we go. We can see you, Anne-Marie, now. So all good. So welcome, everybody, to the next session during this year's IIPP forum. This session is Rethinking Work and Work Organizing. And we have a wonderful panel with us today. And before I introduce the panelists and let them talk, I'll do a very brief introduction of what we're trying to do here. So if you look at, you all have lots of propaganda on your table, so please don't read it now, read it afterwards. But if you look at it, there is a sort of our big tagline at the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose is around rethinking the state. Of course, when we think about the work, then the work is in many ways where a lot of these things that the state is about and the private sector interaction with the state, this is where it happens very often in our workday, in our everyday lives. So in a way, work is a very good and interesting example to discuss and think about, because a lot of things come together in the work and work-life balance as well. And today's panel, we really start, probably I should have said who I am as well, right? So,
Yes.
Oh, sorry. My name is Hilary Cottam. I'm a professor at Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose and also deputy director, and I will chair today's panel. But I'm the least important person here, so never mind that I didn't introduce myself. But we have the reason we have this panel today is the new book by Hilary Cottam, to my left, which is called The Work We Need. You can buy this book and many others by IIPP authors and other people who are in this forum outside. If you haven't done already, you can later ask for autographs as well. These books will be very expensive in 20, 30 years' time, or nobody has books anymore. And we are all submerged underwater. So it will be very, very vintage thing to do. Yeah, so, and Hilary's work, if you don't know, is very much around work life, but also really about the idea of what have we become, and through our work, through our technology, through our capitalist systems. And it's also in many ways about loss of self and selfhood and understanding who we are and what we do. And I think this is why her work is so important, because not only does it bring together those different strands of theory and practice from economics and political science and anthropology and design into wonderful human stories, because the way she works in practice, but it's really about actually trying to understand where are we going. We all look back and we see a lot of politics today is about looking back, the politics of grievance, what have we lost, and we see all the right-wing populism speaking to that sense of loss, but they have very little to say where are we going. And that's why I think Hilary's work is really important, because she shows what can be our new sense of collective, who we are as people together, but also ourselves, who we are as people. And I think in that sense, it's a brilliant book, and I highly recommend it that you buy, because we are really seeing the emergence of some of the topics that probably many of us will be dealing for the rest of our lives. Loneliness, where are we living, working in our family, what are our relationships in our communities? And so this is something that we have to rethink, and her work is a wonderful starting point. But before I give the floor to Hilary, I would like to introduce also our other panelists. We have, and Hilary Cottam, I think, doesn't need an introduction. She's the author of the book we are talking about today, but she, of course, has a previous wonderful book, Radical Help. If you don't have that, go buy that as well. And she used to work in the Design Council, then she had her own practice, Participle, and where she has been always working in a very bottom-up way with people where they are actually living and working and trying to make sense of what is happening in our work life, but also in our welfare life, and how do we think about care and all of those things. And of course, she's a wonderful teacher. She teaches on our MPA course in IIPP. All of our students have the experience. What does it mean to work with Hilary Cottam? But on my extreme left, not on purpose,
Politically.
politically, is wonderful Mariana Mazzucato, of course, director of IIPP and professor, and probably doesn't really need an introduction, but she's an economist by trade, and of course an author of many wonderful books, from the entrepreneurial state to value of everything, mission economy, and also working on a most recent book on the common good economics, which you can perhaps pre-order? No, not yet.
No,
Well,
I have to write it.
yeah. Well, wait a minute. After your holidays, you can pre-order Mariana's book as well. But yeah, our other books are in the hallway. And then we have online. We have wonderful Anne-Marie Slaughter. Hopefully you can hear us. She is at the moment, I believe you are in Rome. Actually, I was told. I hope it's true.
Italy.
It's true, okay. But she's actually a lawyer and legal scholar, has worked at the University of Harvard and Princeton, but also has a really significant experience in actual politics. She has worked for Hilary Cottam's State Department, and
Hilary Clinton.
The other HC, the rather more important HC.
You have a State
Good.
Department now.
You're paying attention. That was the, like you have now, that you have secretaries who make mistakes on purpose, so they show that we are not all ChatGPT. We still are actually writing notes. So I also make that. I'm not a robot. Hope you can tell. But Anne-Marie Slaughter, coming back to her, she's now heading the New America Foundation, and also her foundation was working with Hilary on parts of her book and parts of her work, and so we will try to bring all of this together. So the way we'll try to spend the next 45 minutes, oh my God, I have spent so much time, on just talking. We'll have Hilary first to talk about how we got here, why we got here, the nature of your current work, and where you think we are heading. Over to you, Hilary.
Thank you. Can I just ask, can people in the back of the room hear us? Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very honoured to be here. A big thank you to Carolina Alves, if she's in the room, for this incredible 3-day festival that I know with colleagues she's engineered. It's brilliant for me to be with Mariana, not only because I'm very proud to be a professor at IIPP, but because Mariana's work is obviously core to the book. And also with Anne-Marie, who has been like such an important thinking partner, co-developing concepts in the book. And the US leg of the book, which I'll talk about, would not have happened without the support of New America and the Policy Lab. So it's just really, I'm really grateful to Anne-Marie for joining us today, because without Anne-Marie, this book definitely would not have happened. So I, as many of you know, really have spent decades working on the welfare state. And it was actually whilst I was writing the first book, Radical Help, and kind of taking a break from rolling that rock of practice up the hill, that I began to really reflect on something that I saw in all the communities I was working in, but hadn't sort of really had time to think about, which was about the disappearance of good work. And I, became conscious that over the decades I've been working, that more and more problems which are actually economic, governments have tried to address through social policy. So that, where things are going wrong economically, there's been a kind of focus on the welfare state to try and put those things right. And I began to really think about what happened. I think the microphone has stopped. I can hear that. Can you hear me now? Is it that I leant on the microphone? I need to sit forward and I need to improve my posture, basically. Very important. I've done the wrong sort of work all my life for posture. That's something that I'm a bit ashamed about. But so I think that, to pick up my kind of train of thought, I became, really sort of interested in what happens when good work goes, or where you live in a community where there is good work, but you can't access that good work. And I think we're seeing that play out now in politics, which is that if we don't have a role, if we don't have work, things begin to get extremely complicated. It has very big democratic implications. But at the time, I wanted to know how this works in the places that I work. And I started off by asking politicians, what's going on? What are the policies for bringing good work and economies to the places where I work? And they would go like, Hilary, just don't ask me. It's just so complicated. Don't ask me. And I thought, well, this is incredible. This is the territory of economists, and I'm not an economist, but I need to find out. And so I started what became a series of journeys, essentially asking workers, what do they think that good 21st century work should look like, and how should we get there? What should we do? And so I worked I started before the pandemic and I worked in 5 post-industrial locations in Britain. And then later, with the sponsorship of New America, I went to the US and I worked east to west. So I started in Baltimore, I worked in Detroit, and then I ended up in Silicon Valley. And in all those places, I invited workers in small groups to join me for a 3-hour imagining, where we had simple tools and we explored these 2 questions. What should good work look like in the 21st century, and how should we get there? And I've worked with grave diggers, carers, academics, lawyers, consultants, nuclear weapon makers. I mean, you name it, I've worked. I think it'd be hard to find, I'm sure there is, but it would be hard to find workers that I haven't worked with. I originally started with economic categories, and they, gig worker, low-paid worker, but they quite quickly broke down. And my original intention actually wasn't to write a book. But when I kind of listened to the recordings, what I heard so strongly over the kind of all the hubbub and the talk were these sort of 6 themes, if you like, which are the principles of the book, that workers were telling me again and again, whether it was a gravedigger in Kilmarnock or a consultant for a kind of, I won't name a company in London, they were telling me that the same things are important, and that these 6 principles, which basically form the core of the book, are not things really that are discussed in the public domain. They're there in policy making, but very, very tangential. And I think it's really interesting that these are kind of like doable, big shared ideas that we're not talking about. So I kind of thought, I have to write about this. And the other reason, the other impetus for the book was not only having heard this, but I'm a bit of an intellectual mongrel. Originally, though, I studied history. And I'm particularly interested in the history of technology revolutions, and of course, very much kind of embedded in the work of Carlota Perez, our colleague here at IIPP. And I'm, was asking, what I see from Carlota's work and a study of technology revolutions is that technology generally, at a certain point, improves work. It is accompanied by a work revolution. And in this technology revolution, it's been going for some time, and that work revolution is not evident. Actually, 2 things have happened. The first is that technology has been used to kind of deepen the grooves of existing business models, which means greater inequality, more exploitation for workers. That usually happens at the beginning of a technology revolution. But the other is that we have become very romantic, kind of in despair. We've begun to look back at 20th century models of work with the idea of like, oh, if only we could get back to what we used to have, at least that would be better than now. And the reality of 20th century work is that it was absolutely great if you were a white man with a wife in a unionized job. But for most other people, it was really pretty poor. And so I think it's really dangerous to kind of romanticize 20th century work. So these 2 impetuses, if you like, from kind of sort of history, ideas, and the work on the ground led to kind of thinking about what could we put forward as a proposal for the future of work.
Thank you. And as I said, I find so interesting how you bring together not only work and technology and the ways that our societies evolve, but also the feeling of self and the loss of self as well. And I find all really interesting that at the end of the book, you say that actually you wanted to call it the workers' revolution. And maybe you can tell us why didn't you call it that?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question is really interesting on 2 levels. So there are 6 principles of work, and the first is, of course, basics. Like, it's not good work if we're, in fact, people say that is not work if we're not paid enough to live on, stand on our own feet, if we're surveilled, and so on. And I mean, a very significant number of workers in the US and the UK don't receive legal rights. In fact, in the UK, we've got 1/3 of the number of inspectors that we should have to kind of find out what's going on in work. So this whole, at the moment, we've got a government that rightly are pushing for new rights for workers. But what workers will say is, rights, great, but nobody is actually enforcing those rights, like what's actually going on the ground. And then one of the other critical principles is meaning, because actually we find out who we are through work. Work enables us to grow, and work is designed around the wrong human template. It's not currently designed in order to enable us to grow. But it's true that I wanted to call my book The Workers' Revolution. And this title was turned down by my publishers because what they said was that, we don't think, when you write a book, the publisher who wants to publish it goes to pitch your idea to the team. And the team were like, well, we'd love to buy this book, but she has to change the title. And the reason for changing the title is because we're not workers. That the label worker has become attached to menial work, low-paid work. It has no longer stuck with all of us. But in the book, everybody who is living off earned income in some way, even if you're not currently working, let's say you're a mum, is a worker. The only people who are not workers are those who are living off assets, or inheritance, which means that most people still, even in great inequality, are workers. And I think one of the things I would say is buy a book and buy a book for somebody else, because one of the critical things we need to do, because we share these big dreams, which perhaps we'll talk about a bit, is we need to kind of reclaim the worker label to see that we share a vision and that we can come together around that vision no matter the work that we do. And I think that would be the first step in the kind of velvet revolution, if you like, because the revolution will happen. And one of the questions the book asks is, are we ready? Like, have we got a shared manifesto for how we want to shape work? And that is what's in the book. But we can only kind of coalesce around it if we all consider ourselves to be workers. So the title was thrown out, but my campaign, I mean, I'm terrible at titles anyway, but it took me longer to title my PhD than to do all the work. So this is not my strong point. But I think that the idea of the workers' revolution still remains very core to the book, yes.
Thank you. And we'll come back to some of those issues. So Mariana, you are, I think, one of the most cited authors in this book, next to Carlota Perez, your good friend. And I think there's a very good reason for that, because, of course, your work is very much talking about the idea of value and who produces value in our societies. And in many ways, of course, as we know, the share of labor in that value production has been decreasing and decreasing. So how does your work or how do you see where we are today in terms of work and value, and where we are going perhaps in terms of the velvet revolution?
Great. Well, first of all, congratulations. What a great book. I can't say that I read the whole thing, but my team has. And they put all these little stickers, different colors, and I was like, oh my God, they're just, trying to prove that they read it, and who knows if they actually did. But then you open it up, and for each color, it says, pink is labor, blue is climate, green is finance, yellow is tech and AI. And then she said they should have put a color for where I cite you, but anyway. But especially thank you for continuing, right? Because this is kind of volume 2, or other stuff you've done that hasn't necessarily gone into books of what you've been arguing. And these kind of, these principles that you look at are very much actually related to what you also wrote about in Radical Help, which is you can't have a welfare state that's done at people, right? You want the services themselves, for example, to be informed by the experience on the ground. With the late Pope Francis, we were actually working with for 2 years, called the principle of subsidiarity. You go down to the most local level, you learn from that, and you bring those lessons up, but also he talked about needing to, and I'm not religious at all, by the way. In fact, he used to say, come on, a bit of religion. He also talked about the preferential option for the poor, right? Like, you have to test the policy on the most vulnerable people, but that concept of just poor is not useful, right? How do people become poor? And also, if you are poor, what does it mean to actually not just look at income, but precisely these different principles in terms of also, for example, how trade unions or government policies would be interacting with the subject. So again, at the very local level, at the participatory level, and always asking, is this actually being informed by experience? I think the challenge that I'd say, and then I'll connect it to kind of what I've been thinking about and also this new book I'm writing, the challenge is how do we not choose that we either talk about kind of the local level, participatory structures, kind of small examples around the world, or look at big systemic changes that we need. And I don't think you do actually choose one or the other.
Well, I think it's really interesting, actually, because workers don't choose one or the other, and that's really important.
Absolutely. And a good trade union wouldn't.
Exactly.
But there's, just like with everything, there's good and bad ways to confront things. And so I just want to say that some of these big issues that are systemic issues, which you don't necessarily talk about in the book, but I just want to put out there as context, is, the labor share of global income is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been. And what's interesting, by the way, is even just classic GDP measures, which many of us, you, me, and others have criticized, because GDP is this kind of just number. It'd be like you're driving a car and you just know how much gas is in it or just how fast you're going, right? We actually need dashboards. Kate Rayworth, actually, in the next session, she's created her own a donut economics dashboard. But actually, with GDP in its most kind of simple way, where you can look at either the demand side, the product side, or the income side, you can see this issue. You can divide GDP by wages, interest, rents, and profits. And the wage share of global income is at one of the lowest levels it's ever been. And yet we hardly ever talk about that. The same people, by the way, who critique GDP don't talk about that. And I've also argued that there's a lot of rents that we don't even call rents. So the profit share, for example, what's the difference between you talked about value creation and value extraction. So I think the challenge is, how do we marry this book and actually your kind of lifelong work, right? Where it's very much about experience on the ground, the local, listening, empathy, which, I said yesterday in one of our sessions should be one of those dynamic capabilities we also teach the civil service, the art of listening, with also always keeping in context these kind of, let's just call it global, but it's not actually global because there's varieties of capitalism in some parts of the world, in the UK and in the US, with the very Anglo-Saxonized version of capitalism, we have allowed capitalism to be super financialized. And part of the reason why the wage share has been falling is that when you have companies, no matter how they're structured, by the way, because there's different companies that do this, that are not reinvesting their profits back into the economy, not reinvesting into better working conditions, not sharing the returns that they're earning with the labor force, but engaging in different financialized practices. For example, just a symptom, share buybacks, over 7 trillion has been used by the large companies just buying back their shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. That level of sickness in the system needs to be confronted at the same time that we also really pay a lot of attention to these issues you talk about. So that's just one thing I wanted to put out there. The second thing, just to say, we have to talk more. This new book that I'm writing is very much actually partly also inspired by your work, thinking, what does it mean for our so-called missions approach, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, hopefully, in these other sessions, to take some of these participatory and co-creation features and principles, because they have to be principles, into account. And so in this new book I'm writing on the common good, I break it down into 5 principles of we need directionality, right? Otherwise we get the wrong kind of direction. We have a super financialized global economy. What's a different direction for inclusion, sustainability, and so on? But who's going to set that direction? So the second point is co-creating the agenda seriously, not tokenistically, not just by giving people surveys, right? So the different examples you give actually are fantastic ways in which we actually have evidence, for example, of not just participation, but then the third principle, do we also then share in the rewards? What's the point of participating if then all the rewards go, to one side? So reward sharing, and another principle is knowledge sharing. In the 21st century knowledge economy, unless you're sharing constantly our learnings, then that's not a good economy. And the last one's transparency and accountability, so we even know what's going on. And I just think it's really interesting to, the reason I think we think about principles is otherwise you get common good washing, you get mission washing, you get good work washing, and we need principles to hold the system accountable. Then these principles might evolve, they might be different, in my work, in your work, but without that, we just allow cute little experiments to be bragged about, whether it's a cooperative in a place or a place where there was real citizen engagement with resident associations. We worked on that in Camden, but they don't form the system. Why don't they form the system? Because we can't scale it. Why can't we scale it? Because there's no pressure on the system to really change. Roberto Unger has written a bit about this as well. And so I just think, I'll just sort of stop there, but just maybe to allude also to another great book that came out recently by another woman who came to the Institute recently, Jennifer Palka. She says something, I think, very symbiotic and synergetic, which is that the services, like that you talked about in the in Radical Help, in the modern digital economy, themselves are really messed up, not only because of how we know AI is being used kind of for bad instead of good. Shoshana Zuboff's book about you think you're searching Google for free, but it's searching you for free. But she says the digital platforms that governments are actually setting up do not interact with people's experience. So when you are accessing your welfare payments, for example, using gov.uk, has that been informed by people who've used that before to access their welfare benefits? So if people designing a system haven't experienced that system, and if the people who haven't informed that system, then we're in trouble. And the best thing that we did in Camden was using, for example, the experience of carers and carees in Camden to design what we've been arguing for a long time, which is outcomes-oriented procurement. So adult social care and housing estates should be designed by those who experience it. And again, thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for running the workshops for our students. So you're not just teaching at them with, PowerPoints, you bring them into your funky studio in South London. And I just think your work has really inspired lots of us. As I mentioned, I cite you quite a bit in this new book, but also I know that our students have been really inspired by how you actually marry, this kind of theoretical, if you want, lens, because you're not just talking about examples, but with the need to really nest it in human experience.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for this wonderful discussion. So now we go to Anne-Marie, well, I want to talk to you about a concept that is very prominent in the book, which is Homo sapiens integra. So it's a new view of a human being, if you will, or of ourselves. And there's an interesting parallel when you think about late 19th century Friedrich Nietzsche going mad in Germany, and he sort of wrote this idea of superhuman. And I think in many ways he was seeing how a 19th century personhood is losing meaning, and he talked about superhumans. And the way he described it was that superhumans are emerging when humans are losing meaning. So they're becoming meaningless in the sort of industrial economies. And I think it's interesting, you and Hilary talk a lot about sapiens integra instead of Homo economicus. So I ask you, is the Homo economicus losing meaning, and are we actually seeing a new version of ourselves emerging?
Well, thank you. I'm hoping that the audience can see me and that I'm not just on a screen in front of you, but if not, then people can hear me.
Yes.
And I will start just by saying I love this book. It's when I met Hilary almost a decade ago, right when Radical Help came out, I was completely transported, really. It's such original, powerful thinking. And this book is indeed the continuation. And I'll just make one or two points about what I love about the book and then come to your question. Hilary is very direct. She says, if we want to figure out what's good work, let's ask the workers. But let's not ask them all of us, I take that point, are workers. But she went to many different work sites. But she didn't just survey people. Mm-hmm. She invited them to imagine. And indeed, that's a large part of what is missing in many jobs. Good jobs give you the capacity to imagine, to innovate, to be an effective agent. So that itself, I know from people who were with her in Baltimore, they said it was just extraordinary. The people came in and they were skeptical, as you might expect. And Hilary has these cards, and she gave them the cards, and she asked them to start thinking about what were good jobs. And as she said, these 6 principles come out across many, many different sites. And she talks about her pilgrimage as method. And I think in a world in which we're drowning in statistics and many of them are going in the wrong direction, there's just a human dimension there that is deeply inspiring. The core, her core point is, and this I think we're all agreed on, is, good work must yield enough income to provide for the basics at a healthy level, but that's just not enough. Money alone, even quite a lot of money, I mean, there are people who work only for money, but most don't, is not enough. That you have to look to meaning and care and place and play. But the way we think about who the worker is, and more fundamentally, what human nature is essential to answering Mariana's question about how you can actually scale this approach. And Hilary and I did some work on the care economy and thinking about care as a relationship rather than as a service. It's actually both in many ways. And this idea of sapiens integra, which we were playing around with, everybody knows Homo economicus is inadequate. Right? There are countless articles that have been written on that. Everybody knows that, but we don't actually have a different vision, an operationalizable vision of what a human is in its place. So we ditched Homo completely and went directly for Sapiens integra. And that just means a whole person, whereas Homo economicus is just half, the hyper rational calculating half, which is certainly there, but it's only half. And one way to think about this, I think, more, it helps flesh out the idea of Sapiens integra, is if you think of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you get basic needs. In some ways, it's like Hilary's principles. You start with basic needs. Halfway up, you get to love and belonging. And then at the top, there's self-actualization. Now, that is a vision of human needs that is not really based on whole people, or at least not when you talk to neuroscientists and anthropologists and biologists and sociologists and people who do child development. What they know is that human beings need connection just as much as they need separation, that they need a relational identity. I'm a mother, daughter, sister, wife, friend, defined in terms of my relations with others, as much as they also need an individual identity. I'm a professor. I'm a gardener. But you need both, and you need interdependence as much as independence, and you need belonging as much as you need self-actualization. So here's how you bring that, you apply that concept to get to the systemic forces. Because if you start by thinking, if you are an economic policymaker or a social policymaker, or frankly, as I have been, a foreign policymaker, you have to start with an idea of who you're serving, the public. But the public, of course, are individual human beings. What do they need? And if you assume that they need connection and community as much as they need income, then you start thinking, I'll give you just one example, you start thinking about work differently, you start thinking about economic policy differently, you start thinking about housing differently and family differently. One good example is that you would just start assuming that all workers of every kind will be caregivers at some point in their life, because all workers have a relational identity just as much as their work identity. And at some point in their lives, whether it's children or parents or siblings or friends, that need to be connected, and those connections will in fact be something that they need to attend to. It's a real need. So Mariana, to your point, I think the smaller scale experiments reinforce this idea in so many ways. And that's part of what's so powerful about Hilary's concept of good work. And she goes further. She talks about time. She talks about care. She talks about play. But if you take sort of the distillation of all those smaller pilots or experiments, and you then say, look, we really need to not just to think about how to measure GDP differently, but think about a whole human being. So let me just close on two quick points. You mentioned Jen Palka, and Jen is one of the big apostles or promoters of the abundance agenda, and where we need more of lots of things. We need more housing. We need more infrastructure. I have a lot of time for lots of parts of that, but that's a good example of where they don't talk about needing more care. And yet I would say that is absolutely, it's a very materialistic view of what human beings need. And then the last point is I've just spent 2 days with 40 AI officials from states across the United States. So these are people in charge of AI. They are public servants, they believe in government, and they want to serve people better. And their view is that if you can use AI in careful ways, but to reduce the vertical part of government, the layers of bureaucracy, and actually improve government services with humans, not either or, to reach AI's potential, then, and this is their words, then you can transform not just how government does things, but what government does. And it does open the door to far more co-creation. So it goes from vertical to horizontal. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much. Mariana, you want to react?
Well, just super quickly, it just occurred to me that a good parallel is the work we did on housing. We said, look, there is a human rights approach, right? So you've introduced principles, super well informed from your work, but there's others who've done principles work. And again, the human rights approach, if you break it down, it is a principles approach. It just hasn't been used. So we said, what if you applied the principles around human rights to housing? And you look at all the kind of 6 principles that we wrote about with Leilani Farha, who's the UN envoy for the human rights to homes, which is one of the key capabilities of Amartya Sen. And there's structural forces preventing that, right? So you need to identify what those structural forces are. To be very simplistic, what I was talking about before was shareholder value as a way to think about the company. That's not just a bad idea. As the head of General Motors once said, the stupidest idea ever. There's structural forces that made that come into place, and those structural forces are alive and well, and they're not changing. So I think, with housing especially, where the real estate bubble, the financial crisis, this wasn't just caused by, random dudes. It was caused by a very specific way in which we treat homes and turn them into an asset to be bought and sold. And it's impossible to achieve those 6 principles that we introduced around housing, cultural adequacy, anyway, all sorts of different things, the distance to your home, a building, a formation of community, so on and so forth, if what's actually driving housing is finance. Right, and I mentioned yesterday that Ada Colau's judges, she was the mayor of Barcelona and worked on the housing movement at a very local level. She said that she would measure, as a mayor, her success by how much she was sued by the financial sector. So I was just wondering if you could talk more about the structural forces, the systemic forces, because it's not just about building systems, the systemic forces that you identify in the book that are currently going against these pillars and principles that you've introduced.
Yes, so maybe I can pick up a bit from Anne-Marie and go to that, because I think in the book what I'm really interested actually are the principles and the forces that are going towards something new.
Right.
And actually I'm very interested in how there are, if we take the idea of time, the data shows incontrovertibly that workers are more productive if they work less, because guess what, we're not cogs in a machine. And yet, although more and more companies do the work, more and more municipalities do the work, partly because of structural forces, but actually just because of kind of political belief, this does not get taken on. So, a lot of that stuff is there. And I think what's, the work Anne-Marie and I have done on Sapiens Integra, I think what's really important is it is partly about principles, and the 6 principles are on a par in the book. But it is also about mindsets, because the thing is that work is cut out on an unspoken template of who we think we are and what motivates us. And what Sapiens Integra is about challenging that absolutely invisible template. And you see it everywhere. You see it in job adverts that always tell you what you're going to earn and tell you that you'll have some highfalutin title, but don't tell you about the purpose of your work. And if you go to a job interview and ask somebody about, well, what am I actually going to be doing, they probably won't hire you. You see it in media coverage of strikes. So, as I wrote this book, a whole roll of strikes was, going across Britain. And every single one of those strikes was reported as about pay. But for instance, train drivers, they earn between 40 and 70,000 a year and they're on strike. But the strikes were actually about the gigification of their work and about the robbery of time. They were not about the wages. But because journalists also think, oh, this is a story about work, this is a story about Homo economicus, I've got this invisible design in my head, the whole conversation carries on. So I think that those principles in the book are positioned in a slightly different way from the way you're talking about, because they are about trying to challenge a deep mindset with the way that we look at these issues and how we talk about these issues. But then to your question about structure, I think the structures are twofold. The structures are in business and the structures are in the state. We could talk about them in academia in lots of places. But so one of the things that really interests me is that in work revolutions, in technology revolutions, generally you find that a new form of business leader comes forward and they challenge the social contract because they realize that they're not going to have a good business if they carry on working in the same way. So, of course, the most famous person was Ford in the Industrial Revolution. He was a horrible man. He shot his workers. He was anti-Semitic. But he took his board to court to pay his workers more because the board wouldn't agree, and he won, because without that, he wouldn't have had a market for his cars. So one whole part of this...
Trade unionists. He shot
That's
at
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But he gave them a different social contract because he understood that the ground was shifting. And in every technology revolution, we see these business leaders, and they're very important. They're not philanthropists, but they understand structures. And you have to make alliances with them, very careful alliances, because exactly as you're saying, and as all the workers recognize that I meet, we have to think differently about power, which is going to come on to my second point, but we have to make different kinds of alliances. And so I went to look for these, what I call new industrialists. Who are the people who understand that technology is a force and understand that we need a different contract, a different social contract to have a different economy that is productive, that is all the things, for example, that our Chancellor is looking for, but is never going to achieve for the very reasons that you just described. So I thought they should be in Silicon Valley. Of course, they're not in Silicon Valley. But I have found, and I discuss in the book, people who are at the leaders who are at the forefront of technology have very big businesses and have completely different ideas about skills, labor share of the value of what they're doing. And I think it's really interesting because technology revolutions always threw up these two models. And so one of the things, last night I was at the LSE on a panel talking about what should we do about Jeff Bezos, but how interesting that we should all spend our evening talking about what we should do about Jeff Bezos. Of course, we need to do something about him, and he's a billionaire and he's influencing everything else. But why? If I tell you the names of all the people in the book, you will never have heard of them. And they are running huge companies, multi-billion-dollar enterprises working in a completely different way. So one of the things is we have to shift the stories, we have to shift what we're talking about. And then the second thing that's really important for structures is we have to organize differently. So the other thing that happens in technology revolutions is that work organizations have to change. So when the Industrial Revolution came along, workers realized quite fast that their protection, which was guilds, was not going to do it for them, because guilds are like, I'm really skilled, pay me this. Suddenly you're on a production line and it doesn't matter what your skills are. Like, Mariana, you're not working fast enough, so we're going to replace you with Reiner. But what workers had was that they were huge numbers in one place, on a production line, in a shipyard. They could kind of organize vertically in mass. And that was unbelievably important. It drove up the share of value for a long time that workers had. And of course, we wouldn't have had a welfare state, which is what so much of my work is about, if we hadn't got trade unions. But these vertically organized ways these vertical integrated hierarchical ways of organizing are finding it very difficult to confront the new forms of capital, which is why in the second half of Imaginings, I gave people a paper tablecloth and I said to them, could you design what a work organization should look like in this century? And that's very interesting, because out of that came a code. Again, the same ideas came again and again, and very interesting ideas from workers about how power has changed, what needs to shift, and about the role of place, and something that you talked about at the very beginning, Mariana, about how we can not have this dichotomy between kind of the local and the global. People are thinking kind of, very strategically about that. So part of the book, and I think the title of our session is about work organizing, because I think this is such a critical part of how we bring about a revolution, is that we need to work in very different ways. And the place component is so important. The thing that makes these organizations work, and the examples in the book, is a connection to place. The one identifying factor of all the kind of new industrialists who are driving forward productivity is that they are concerned and connected to the places they live in, just as 19th century industrialists were. So, when I talk to Satya Nadella for the book, he talks about how we've got to kind of maximize value. And, Microsoft, he's, one of the more kind of thoughtful, should we say, Silicon Valley leaders. But, he does not see what's happening in Arizona with the servers that he's parking in that place. But if you are connected to a place and building a business, you're thinking completely differently about it. So I think that those structural shifts are there. The question is how we join them together, how we shine light on them, and how we shift the stories that we're telling.
Brilliant. You want to go ahead, Ria?
Were you going to open up to the audience?
Yeah, because because I think we have around 10 minutes.
And I should say to Anne-Marie that everybody can see you. Here, you look
huge.
like you're on the panel with us.
Yes.
I'm pleased to say. Yeah.
So do we have microphones, or somebody is roving around, or did I completely misunderstand that we're taking questions? If not, I'm also fine to ask.
Be brave.
Yeah, be brave.
Here
There's like two people right over here. There is. Ben is running. He gets his steps in for the day.
A very big room.
Yeah, that's this first table here, and then Oh, sorry. Yeah.
One mic.
Let's have a woman.
Thank you. Thank you, Hilary, and everyone on the panel. I just wanted to pick up on something that Anne-Marie mentioned, and that I know is something that you think about a lot, Hilary, which is what does technology do in all of these questions? We talk a lot about technology as damaging workers' rights, lots of perhaps not very accurate predictions about how technology will steal all our jobs. And then we also talk about AI as freeing up time, back office time, so that we can spend more time face to face. What I'm interested in is, can technology actually help us to build relationships? Can technology be a tool for relational working, for a relational welfare state? So it's not the bad guy, and it's not just about efficiency, but can it be also about relationships and helping us to develop how we work relationally?
Thank you. There is a gentleman in your table. Yeah. Let's do 3 questions and then.
Hello, thank you very much. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. It's quite a technical question. There are quite a lot of kind of ways of assessing work. International Labour Organization is probably the predominant one, but there are quite a lot of others that kind of make implicit judgments about what should be monitored, which obviously implies a value system. My question is, are they any good in the light of your insights into work in this broader sense? Do they come anywhere close to measuring the right things? And the reason it's topical is because the United Nations is currently working, as you probably know this, on its Beyond GDP agenda, and work is part of that. And that they're kind of looking at these frameworks and trying to make sense of what should be included in future beyond GDP monitoring systems, and therefore the value, as I say, the value system. So I'd be interested in your view on that.
Thank you, and let's do one more in that, Bridget, into that table then. Or then we go to Nora as well, then we're done. Sorry.
Thanks, Raina. Really interesting panel, thank you. I want to pick up on your last thread around telling different stories about different people, because I think it's such an important tool to enable some of the change you're speaking about. How do we do that practically, at least taking the UK as a context where civil service, is declining, how many comms people and capacity we're hiring, DDAP frameworks don't allow for those communication skills in recruitment process, and digital roles are urgently needed, but again, are priorities over these wider skills around communication, storytelling, and developing that cognitive empathy to help drive these moments and of change. So really curious in what are the tactics to almost institutionalize those storytelling skills and capacity in the public service. Have you seen anything through your work that we can take into the UK context or others?
Thank you, and let's do Nora. That's the last question. Then but Hilary will be around, so, and Mariana, you can ask.
Shall I have a go?
Oh, there was one more.
Oh, sorry. I can't see, the lights are so bad, I can't see anybody looking out this way. Sorry, hello.
No worries, this is Nora. Just to say thank you so much for a really, really interesting panel. I've learned a lot, and writing down things like Sapiens Integra, which I'd not heard about, and looking up the Social Revolution Manifesto that you wrote quite a few years ago. It feels to me like we're at a moment in time where we need this thinking more than ever. Obviously, this event is part of that, and what's fantastic is that we have a lot of women in this space, between Anne-Marie, Hilary, Mariana, Kate later. How do we start to tell this alternative story to Homo economicus, and how do we really put this higher on the agenda, and how do we do it together, and how do you do it together, is my question to you.
Thank you. Let's take Hilary first, and then Anne-Marie, and then.
Yeah, so really brilliant questions. I want to say something about all of them, so I hope I can speak fast enough and my colleagues can come in. I mean, I think the question about technology is really interesting. One of the things I say in the book is that, that we have this predominant narrative, which is a tools-first narrative. So it's all about the technology, and it's like you can have Daniel Susskind in the work situation going, it's going to be terrible, it's going to take our jobs, even lawyers, journalists, there's no jobs left, versus David Autor, it's going to be great every time you get technology, the jobs are more interesting. And I guess you've asked a very complicated question that I can't kind of answer in the time. But what I would say is that technology revolutions are not about the technology. They are about dreams and culture. And what determines what happens is cultural. It's not economic and it's not technological. And, you know, if we even kind of narrow that down to work, in the last industrial revolution, everybody did not work in oil. The dream was the American dream. We'd have a beautiful house, a picket fence, a fridge, the bigger the better, a kind of, you know, a place at the local tennis club. And that's what drove work, like services, marketing, white goods. So the thing is what's going to, how things are going to be shaped, both in the relational side, but also what we're doing is going to be about the culture, the dreams, what we imagine. And that's why this relates to, I'm kind of very, it means a lot to me that Anne-Marie brought this out, which is that it matters who imagines, who we allow to imagine. It is absolutely political. And when people came, you know, to the imaginings, I always thought they would leave in a tea break because they were like, this is so weird. Like, what are we being asked here? And we don't do stuff like this. And you want us to design an institution? You must be kidding. But everybody got on with it. And then at the end, kind of spent ages hanging around. How can we do this again? We've never thought in this way. So I think the bigger answer to your question is like, who are we going to include in the imagining? On to the question of kind of ILO and everything else. It's not that those systems aren't useful. For instance, a lot of the work that the ILO has done around how health is actually a problem of work, not the other way around. Like this government in Britain thinks that, you know, we're sick and we need to not be sick to go to work, whereas the problem, as the ILO shows us, is that the work is making us sick and we need to deal with the work. So, you know, there's very useful stuff in there. I think that there are sort of two critiques, and one goes to something that Mariana said earlier. So I mean, it's very difficult, this. I can't name names, but I went to visit the board of an international airport, and they are having huge trouble keeping their staff. And they said to me, you know, you've done all this work on meaning and we do all this stuff on values, and like, why can we not keep our staff? And that is, of course, because as I show in the book, meaning is something very different to kind of the corporate values that are on the wall. But afterwards, I got an Uber ride home, and I said to the guy, you know, what do you do? What do you do? Oh, he said, I used to work at this international airport. And I left because the thing is, I couldn't bear those people banging on about corporate values and then reading every day in the paper about the share buybacks, about the, you know, like, people are not stupid. So it's about kind of how those things come together. And I think that is what's shaping work, and that's something that the ILO doesn't want to get into. And the second part of that is that work with meaning means that what you do matters, has a role in the world. And that is very complicated questions about what we're asking people to do, which again, if you want to drive an economy according to traditional ways of GDP, is not going to work. If you want to kind of explore the ideas that Anne-Marie has brought into the room about every worker a carer, the work of care, the kind of economies of care, these kinds of ideas, then you have very different metrics. But that's kind of political, and I don't know kind of to what extent they're going to go there. The question about training, I think, is very interesting. I mean, one of the reasons that I absolutely love being here is that when I teach, the teaching and all our students here are doing practical design methods and they're learning theory. And my work, the teaching I do kind of straddles both. And I think for so long, and particularly in Britain, we've had this kind of idea of like practice, something very micro, very low. Ideas, something really amazing happening in academia. And that, you know, one is about systems and one is just about something very small. And actually the curriculum here at IIPP is very much about challenging that and saying that it's not about bottom up or top down. It's about horizontalism in the way that Anne-Marie positioned it. And it's about kind of different skills. And again, I think that something that I definitely do see again back to place is that, you know, so all civil servants need to come here, basically, is one thing I'd say. But one thing I think is very interesting, and again is in the book, is that there's a big difference in Britain, at least, between local government, who are in place, often from the place, viscerally understand these issues and what they're doing versus what central government is doing. And, you know, I've got examples in the book of municipal governments doing really interesting economic things with kind of, you know, really interesting value chains because they understand the place. And I think one thing would be, you know, like if we could get the centre out to the regions, very different structural things would happen. And thank you for the comment about the big question about women on the panel. So I just want to say we are 3 women discussing work. This is sort of unheard of. You know, I had to get a kind of huge education in labour economics in order to write this book. And it's amazing how, first of all, you think that all labour economists are men, and then you go and look at where did they get their ideas from, and you find that 20 years before, the woman wrote the book. And one of the many, many things that Anne-Marie taught me is like the first thing you do in a book is you look at like who do they cite, and are there any women cited there? Because men also do not cite women. And I'm very, very pleased and very honoured not only to be on this panel, but also to have a kind of index, which is more women than men on this subject. Because, you know, we are more likely to share each other's ideas, to talk about each other's ideas, to kind of say, have you read that brilliant book by Anne-Marie? You've got to go and read Mariana's new book. And I hope you have all read Anne-Marie's books. And they're not here to sign, unfortunately, because Anne-Marie is not with us. But this is, I think this is also part of it, about sharing. Again, Mariana talked about one of her principles is going to be knowledge sharing and how we get these concepts out there and we share.
Great. Let's go to Anne-Marie first, and then Mariana.
So I will be quick. So on the question of technology, and Hilary made the point that the technological revolution is not about the technology, it's about culture and imagination. I totally agree with that. But very concretely, what AI does depends on what we want it to do. So if you look at it in any organization and say, I just want to make people more efficient, I want to cut costs, that's what you'll get, and you'll get fewer workers. If you say, what we are missing are many of the principles that Hilary talks about, that people need more time, but they don't just need more time to be at home. They need more time to be with one another, that we have lost something fundamental when we lose the fabric of human interaction, not all positive, but even there you learn a lot in the workplace. And exactly this idea of, you know, how can we co-create, how can we take that time and use it for these purposes? So that is really up to us. Last thing I will say is, you know, Homo economicus and sapiens integra is not really how most people, those are not words we use in our everyday life, unless we're economists, and even there, I don't think so. The shorthand I often use is, and you can find the article I was referencing in the journal Daedalus, but I often just talk about whole policy for whole people, because that's really a whole person, that's integra, has a much wider range of needs, exact in work and in life. And that's, Hilary has brought that home and made it concrete and given us examples, but also invited us to imagine ourselves.
Thank you so much. So, Mariana, bring us home.
I mean, maybe just quickly, just to to focus on Nora's question. To be completely honest, there's been many people, and especially women, that have actually looked at some of these issues that you raise. I could list them.
In the book, yeah.
They're in the book, exactly. I mean, even just the economics council that I ran for the WHO, it was all women, not surprisingly, because I literally chose the top economists around the world who thought about care. It was a council during COVID on the economics of health for all. And super interesting work by all of them. I think what's really innovative here is, again, using the kind of a concept that we'll hear about, I'm sure, in the next session by Kate, is kind of a dashboard, these principles. But it's only powerful if we can hold a system accountable to those principles. So I think a next step should be, and I'm sure you've done it, but more, I'm thinking next step for us as a community also in the Institute, is to think what then went wrong with some of these other dashboards, like the human rights one that I mentioned around housing, that was super interesting, totally informed on the ground, by the way, but then didn't happen. And that's because there are interests against it. And you're absolutely right. Let's not think what's going against it. Let's look at the different, practices that actually were going for something. I thought that answer was fantastic. But, unless at the same time we are picking away at the structural forces that have prevented 100 years of literature, including Keynes, by the way, a guy, fine, but on time, Marx on the basics, again, so many women around care and more, then, you know what I mean? So the principles feature, the dashboard feature, to hold a system accountable and to point out it's not okay if a company picks and chooses. We'll do the care bit, we'll do a bit of the meaning bit, but the rest, no. So where principles are important is when they're all important. Yeah. And I think one thing I would just ask you, but we don't have to talk about it now because time's up, we have to go welcome our minister who's coming, is how much pushback do you get? Because I know that I measure my own stuff by how much, how do you say, not so much hate, but how do you say, pressure against what we're saying. And sometimes if what we're saying just sounds like common sense, which I'm not saying yours does, but there are a lot of others who've written about the six individually, then we need to make sure that we're ourselves, because it definitely has happened to me as well, aren't part of the problem.
I mean, I think time is up, but what I would say about the principles is that, you know, Ruth Chang, who's a professor of jurisprudence at Oxford, has this principle. She's given a brilliant TED talk about on a par. And the critical thing of these 6 principles is that they're on a par. You can't say, I'll give you the basics, but you can't care.
Yes.
And that is what's happening. Yes, exactly. But I know I'm not allowed to go on anymore.
Interesting.
I just want to say thank you, Rainer, for so generously hosting, for Anne-Marie for coming, and Mariana as well, and for all of you. I hope you will all buy a book, but I'm, you know, really honoured that everybody came. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and join me in thanking. Yeah, so thank you, Anne-Marie, thank you, Mariana, thank you, Hilary, and indeed, you can find the books in the hallway. You can buy them. People are here who wrote them. They can sign it for you. And yeah, don't go away for the next session is at 6 p.m. You can go and get your steps.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
Bye, Anne-Marie.
Big hug.
Thank
I
you.
don't know if you can see
Bye-bye.
it. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.